250 years is the historical lifespan of every major global economic empire. We are witnessing the terrifying real-time collapse of the American superpower cycle right now. Billionaire investor Ray Dalio recently issued a chilling warning at the Munich Security Conference today. He stated that the post-World War II international order has officially broken down. We have officially entered what he calls Stage 6 of the changing world order cycle. This represents a dangerous phase where international law is replaced by raw geopolitical power globally. Before we dive into how this impacts your money, please subscribe to the channel now. Also, leave a comment below telling me exactly where you're watching from today. As a finance professional with 20 years of experience, I monitor these macroeconomic shifts closely. The events unfolding right now in global markets are following a predictable historical pattern perfectly. Dalio deeply studied the rise and fall of empires, like the Dutch and British. Every dominant world power follows an identical historical trajectory known as the big cycle. This cycle always starts with a new world order established after a global military conflict. Peace and prosperity follow as the new superpower establishes dominance through trade and education globally. Eventually, the empire becomes overextended and relies far too heavily on massive debt creation. The financial foundation cracks under the weight of excessive spending and massive currency devaluation steadily. This economic weakness inevitably triggers internal conflicts fueled by historic wealth and political gaps. We are seeing this exact political polarization tearing at the social fabric of America today. Trust in our fundamental institutions has collapsed as extreme populism rises on both sides quickly. The true danger arrives when severe internal weakness collides with a rising external rival power. This is the precise definition of Stage 6, which Dalio calls the law of the jungle. In Stage 6, international treaties and cooperative agreements are immediately abandoned by major nations globally. Disputes are no longer settled in neutral courts, but through severe economic and military pressure. We are currently watching the weaponization of the global financial system play out in real time. Dalio warns that we are standing on the absolute brink of a devastating global capital war. A capital war involves using money and access to markets as weapons against geopolitical adversaries. We are seeing aggressive trade tariffs and strict import restrictions being deployed across all borders. Nations engage in fierce technology wars to protect their most critical intellectual property assets today. The severe escalation involves freezing foreign assets and blocking rivals from essential capital markets entirely. When financial warfare begins, normal economic activities are curtailed and global trade plummets rapidly downward. For the average American investor, this represents an unprecedented threat to traditional wealth preservation strategies. The traditional 60-40 portfolio built on stocks and bonds was strictly designed for peace. That peaceful rules-based world officially died according to leaders at the Munich Security Conference. When geopolitical tensions escalate into Stage 6, conflict traditional safe investments suddenly lose their security. Governments facing existential threats will aggressively regulate nearly all aspects of the private domestic economy. They will dictate exactly which goods can be produced and imported for absolute national security. Capital mobility will be heavily restricted, making it incredibly difficult to move your money offshore. Severe taxation increases will be implemented to support the massive spending required during these conflicts. We are already seeing the United States government running historic deficits to fund geopolitical initiatives. To afford these operations, the central bank is eventually forced to monetize this massive federal debt. Relentless printing of money directly devalues the currency and destroys your actual purchasing power today. Inflation becomes a permanent feature of the economy, rather than a temporary or cyclical anomaly completely. As credit loses its widespread acceptance nations and central banks rapidly shift toward harder physical assets. This is exactly why we are seeing record-breaking gold purchases by central banks worldwide today. Gold becomes the preferred medium for international transactions when trust in fiat currencies completely evaporates. Dalio explicitly highlights gold as the ultimate defensive hedge during these periods of severe systemic disorder. Unlike digital currencies, or fiat paper gold, carries absolutely no counterparty risk in a financial crisis. When global powers weaponize the banking system, you need an asset that exists entirely outside it. The current situation with China and the United States perfectly illustrates this late-cycle dynamic clearly. China has emerged as a formidable rising power directly challenging the established American world order framework. The tension over Taiwan represents the most dangerous geopolitical flashpoint in the modern global economy. If this rivalry escalates into a hot war, the economic consequences would be absolutely catastrophic globally. Global supply chains would fracture instantly, causing massive shortages of essential goods and critical modern technology. Your daily life would be severely impacted by rationing and unprecedented price spikes on absolute necessities. Dalio notes that wars rarely go as planned and are usually far more economically damaging ultimately. Both sides underestimate the true cost of conflict and overestimate their ability to achieve rapid victory. The United States must maintain absolute financial strength to project true geopolitical power moving forward today. Earning more than we spend is the only practical way to avoid the fatal debt spiral. Unfortunately, the current fiscal trajectory of the United States guarantees continued currency debasement and high inflation. The government is creating an environment where the middle class is squeezed from every single direction. Your wages are losing value while your essential living expenses continue to climb relentlessly higher daily. This economic pressure fuels the extreme political polarization that pushes us closer to absolute societal breakdown. A divided nation cannot project the necessary strength to deter aggressive external rivals like China. Stage 6 is characterized by this exact toxic combination of internal chaos and external strategic vulnerability. Investors who ignore these macro-structural shifts will see their life savings decimated by relentless inflation. You cannot rely on the investment strategies that worked perfectly during the previous peaceful economic decades. We are operating in a completely different paradigm, where survival takes precedence over aggressive portfolio growth. Asset preservation must become the absolute top priority for anyone managing a retirement portfolio right now. You must carefully evaluate your exposure to vulnerable supply chains and highly indebted corporate entities today. Companies reliant on global free trade will suffer massive margin compression as tariffs dramatically increase soon. Defense contractors and domestic manufacturing firms will likely see massive capital inflows as political priorities shift. Understanding this big cycle allows you to anticipate these market movements before they actually happen globally. Dalio built his massive fortune by recognizing these exact historical patterns before the general public did. The signs of the changing world order are no longer subtle or hidden from public view. European leaders openly admitted that the old diplomatic frameworks are completely obsolete and entirely broken today. We have officially entered an era where might makes right and military strength dictates global economics. The weaponization of the dollar has forced rival nations to build alternative financial settlement networks quickly. The BRICS nations are actively working to bypass the American banking system and SWIFT network entirely. This threatens the core reserve currency status that has subsidized American living standards for decades now. If the dollar loses its global monopoly, the cost of borrowing for Americans will skyrocket instantly. Mortgage rates and credit card interest will remain painfully high as global dollar demand drastically drops. The illusion of endless prosperity built on cheap foreign credit is finally coming to an end. We are transitioning from an era of global cooperation into an era of ruthless resource competition. Food security and energy independence will become the most critical metrics of a sovereign nation's power. The United States possesses immense natural resources but lacks the political cohesion to utilize them effectively. Our internal divisions are the greatest threat to our survival in this new Stage 6 environment. History proves that empires collapse from within long before they are ever defeated from outside forces. The extreme wealth inequality currently plaguing our society mirrors the conditions preceding the French Revolution exactly. When the bottom half of the population feels completely disenfranchised, the social contract fundamentally breaks forever. Ray Dalio explicitly warns that there is a very high probability of severe civil conflict approaching. We must prepare our portfolios for unprecedented volatility as these long-term debt cycles finally conclude. Moving capital into tangible assets outside the traditional banking system is a mathematically sound defensive strategy. Gold, silver, and productive real estate offer the best protection against Stage 6 financial warfare today. The era of the rules-based global order is over, and the jungle has officially returned. You must adapt your financial mindset to this harsh new reality or risk losing absolutely everything. The internal collapse of a superpower is often more destructive than external geopolitical threats. Dalio extensively tracks 6 specific stages of internal domestic order and societal cohesion historically. The United States currently sits dangerously at the precarious tail end of Stage 5. This specific historical phase is characterized by extreme political polarization and massive wealth inequality. We are currently witnessing a complete breakdown of compromise within our domestic political system. The top 1% of American citizens currently hold roughly 32% assets. This massive economic disparity breeds intense resentment and fuels the rapid rise of populism. Public trust in fundamental institutions like mainstream media and the judicial system is plummeting. Citizens no longer believe the established political system works fairly for the average person. When people value defeating political opponents more than preserving the system, the foundation cracks. Dalio strongly warns that this toxic environment pushes a nation directly into Stage 6. Stage 6 is the terrifying final phase of open civil conflict and societal breakdown. It is the exact moment when internal political fighting paralyzes the government from functioning. A paralyzed government cannot effectively manage massive federal debt or mounting domestic economic crises. The United States government is currently spending over $1 trillion annually on interest. This astronomical debt burden severely limits the central bank's ability to stimulate domestic growth. We are now trapped in a vicious cycle of borrowing money simply to survive. To avoid an immediate debt default, the Federal Reserve will be forced to print. This relentless money printing acts as a hidden tax that completely destroys purchasing power. It transfers real wealth directly from middle-class savers to heavily indebted government entities. The toxic combination of high inflation and deep political division creates perfect economic storms. While America struggles with internal crises, external rivals actively exploit our perceived structural weaknesses. Dalio clearly identifies 5 distinct forms of conflict that define this changing world order. These include trade wars, technology wars, capital wars, geopolitical wars, and kinetic military wars. We are already deeply and aggressively engaged in the first 4 forms of conflict. The ongoing trade war involves massive tariffs functioning as direct taxes on American consumers. These protectionist economic policies completely disrupt global supply chains and significantly drive manufacturing costs. Corporate companies are forced to relocate production facilities, which requires years and massive capital. This transition period guarantees sticky inflation that will completely devastate standard retirement investment returns. The technology war is a fierce global race for supremacy in advanced artificial intelligence. Whichever sovereign nation controls advanced microchips will absolutely dominate the global economy this century. This is exactly why geopolitical tension surrounding Taiwan remains incredibly dangerous for all investors. A severe disruption in semiconductor manufacturing would trigger an immediate catastrophic global economic recession. The capital war involves the aggressive financial weaponization of the United States reserve currency. Imposing severe financial sanctions on foreign adversaries forces them to seek alternative payment systems. We are watching the BRICS nations actively construct a parallel global financial infrastructure now. They are aggressively settling massive international energy trades in local currencies, replacing US dollars. This deliberate de-dollarization trend directly threatens American economic supremacy and global purchasing power. If foreign central banks stop buying our treasury bonds, domestic interest rates absolutely skyrocket. Your monthly mortgage rates and credit card payments are directly tied to global dynamics. The geopolitical war involves the rapid global realignment of strategic military and economic alliances. Sovereign nations are being forced to choose sides between declining power and rising challengers. This severely fractures the global marketplace into isolated economic blocs, refusing to trade cooperatively. The permanent loss of globalized free trade completely destroys corporate profit margins across sectors. Dalio explicitly warns that these 4 conflicts historically precede actual physical military warfare inevitably. The historical parallels to the economic conditions of the 1930s are incredibly striking. During that turbulent era, tariff battles and severe asset freezes quickly escalated into conflict. Investors who failed to recognize those identical historical patterns lost their entire life savings. The current economic transition phase is characterized by extreme volatility and massive market uncertainty. Global central banks are desperately trying to balance inflation control against severe recession risks. But the traditional monetary policy tools are becoming completely ineffective in this dangerous new paradigm. Raising domestic interest rates crushes highly leveraged corporations while failing to fix broken supply chains. Lowering base interest rates would immediately reignite rampant inflation and completely destroy the currency value. This impossible monetary policy trap is precisely what triggers Dalio's predicted massive financial heart attack. A severe financial heart attack occurs when global liquidity suddenly dries up completely without warning. International credit markets freeze entirely, making it impossible for major businesses to roll over debt. This leads to a cascading catastrophic wave of corporate bankruptcies and massive unemployment across America. During these chaotic periods of severe corporate deleveraging, cash and traditional bonds offer terrible protection. The federal government will aggressively print massive amounts of currency to bail out failing institutions. This guarantees the real return on fiat currency investments will remain deeply and permanently negative. You must fundamentally restructure your entire personal investment approach to survive this historic wealth transfer. Relying on the standard financial advice from the previous 40 peaceful years is incredibly dangerous. The fundamental rules of the economic game have been completely rewritten by these geopolitical shifts. Dalio strongly emphasizes the critical importance of holding truly diversified and historically resilient tangible assets. Physical precious metals provide a vital, proven safe haven against both inflation and systemic collapse. Physical gold is not a speculative investment, but rather essential insurance for your financial survival. It has perfectly maintained its real purchasing power through every single major empire collapse historically. Productive real estate can also offer substantial protection if you secure long-term fixed financing. However, you must be incredibly cautious regarding the specific geographic location of your physical properties. Stage 6. Internal domestic conflict makes major metropolitan areas highly vulnerable to extreme social unrest. Massive capital flight from declining regions will completely decimate urban commercial real estate property valuations. Smart investors must actively seek out tangible assets that produce essential resources like food globally. Productive agricultural land and robust energy infrastructure will remain incredibly valuable, regardless of political climates. These highly productive assets generate real sustainable yield that cannot be easily inflated by governments. You critically need to actively minimize your financial exposure to highly vulnerable international supply chains. Corporate companies that rely heavily on manufacturing in hostile foreign territories face massive operational risks. Focus instead entirely on domestic producers who control their own critical material sourcing and distribution. The global shift toward resource nationalism guarantees that essential raw materials will become increasingly expensive. Investing directly in the physical commodities themselves offers a powerful direct hedge against severe fragmentation. We are moving very rapidly from an economy based on financial engineering to physical reality. The previous era of generating massive paper wealth simply by holding broad index funds ends. Active strategic risk management is the absolute only way to protect your capital moving forward. You must constantly and vigilantly monitor the escalating tension between the United States and rivals. Every single new tariff or diplomatic breakdown rapidly accelerates the transition into this new order. The powerful global elites are already quietly positioning their massive portfolios for this chaotic scenario. They are deliberately exiting vulnerable paper financial assets and rapidly accumulating scarce high-quality resources. You must study their strategic actions closely and aggressively mirror their defensive wealth preservation strategies. Willful ignorance of these repeating historical economic cycles will literally cost you everything you have. The critical window of opportunity to prepare your personal finances for this dramatic shift closes. Once the severe capital controls and domestic asset freezes finally begin, it will be impossible. The desperate government will trap your personal wealth inside the failing system to fund deficits. True financial independence absolutely requires taking immediate proactive steps before the absolute worst case unfolds. You simply cannot trust the mainstream corporate media to accurately warn you about structural dangers. They are financially and politically incentivized to maintain the fragile illusion of economic stability entirely. Protect your precious family by fully acknowledging the harsh historical realities that Dalio clearly outlined. Recognizing these harsh historical realities is the absolute first step toward true financial survival. You must actively transform your entire investment portfolio from a growth mindset to radical preservation. The classic investment advice of simply buying and holding broad index funds is completely dead. Passive investing only works when the underlying geopolitical system guarantees continuous and stable economic expansion. We are now entering a treacherous decade characterized by massive structural contraction and severe fragmentation. You genuinely need to understand exactly how the federal government will respond during this crisis. When sovereign nations face severe existential threats, they inevitably seize private wealth for their survival. History shows that desperate governments implement strict capital controls to completely prevent massive wealth flight. They will legally mandate that domestic retirement accounts hold a massive percentage of government debt. This directly forces everyday American citizens to finance the massive national deficits through retirement savings. This stealth confiscation of your hard-earned wealth happens constantly through artificially low interest rates. Financial repression absolutely guarantees that your savings will constantly lose purchasing power to raging inflation. Dalio explicitly warns that cash and traditional government bonds are the worst possible financial assets. Holding them means you are effectively locking in a guaranteed negative real return over time. To survive this brutal stage 6 environment, you must hold physical assets. Governments cannot print. The absolute smartest money on Wall Street is aggressively moving into hard, tangible global commodities. Physical gold remains the ultimate historical safe haven during periods of extreme global currency devaluation. It is the only true financial asset that is not simultaneously someone else's massive liability. Central banks worldwide are currently hoarding unprecedented record amounts of physical gold in their vaults. They are desperately preparing for the inevitable catastrophic collapse of the current fiat monetary system. You absolutely must mirror the defensive financial actions of these massive global sovereign wealth funds. Silver also offers incredible upside potential because it remains essential for modern global industrial production. The global push toward massive electrification guarantees a permanent structural deficit in global silver supply. Beyond precious metals, you must heavily evaluate your direct exposure to productive domestic real estate. Highly productive agricultural farmland will become incredibly valuable as global food supply chains permanently fracture. Securing absolute food independence is a critical strategic priority for every single major global superpower. You desperately want to own the essential, scarce resources that hostile foreign nations absolutely need. Energy infrastructure and domestic oil production will remain absolute necessities, regardless of geopolitical election outcomes. The global transition to alternative energy sources is moving much slower than political leaders promised. The modern global economy will absolutely require massive amounts of traditional fossil fuels, continually forever. Avoid holding massive equity in multinational corporations that rely heavily on vulnerable international manufacturing hubs. Massive global tariffs will completely decimate the fragile profit margins of these heavily exposed companies. We are rapidly entering a dark era characterized by intense economic protectionism and resource hoarding. Invest exclusively in highly resilient domestic companies that possess absolute control over their supply chains. Corporations that completely dominate their local domestic markets will absolutely thrive during this chaotic transition. You must carefully consider the massive geopolitical risks associated with any emerging market foreign investments. The developing world will face catastrophic sovereign debt defaults as global dollar liquidity suddenly disappears. Foreign countries that borrowed heavily in American dollars will be completely crushed by currency fluctuations. Dalio clearly maps out how this devastating historical debt cycle always ends in massive defaults. The total global debt burden has grown completely impossible to ever actually repay in reality. We are rapidly approaching the absolute mathematical limit of the fiat currency global debt system. The inevitable messy restructuring of this massive debt will cause unprecedented volatility across global markets. You must maintain significant emergency cash reserves outside the traditional banking system for ultimate flexibility. While cash constantly loses value to inflation, it provides crucial strategic optionality during sudden crashes. A massive deflationary credit shock will create generational buying opportunities for highly prepared retail investors. You need available dry powder to aggressively purchase highly distressed assets at absolute market bottoms. However, you must securely store this capital in completely safe locations outside vulnerable regional banks. The fractional reserve banking system is incredibly fragile during periods of severe global economic panic. We already witnessed terrifying bank runs destroying several major regional financial institutions very recently today. The federal government cannot possibly guarantee every single bank deposit during a massive systemic collapse. The blind illusion of total systemic safety is the most dangerous assumption any investor makes. A massive, devastating cyber attack on critical financial infrastructure is a highly probable Stage 6 event. State-sponsored foreign hackers could easily freeze the entire digital banking network for several weeks. You absolutely must possess physical cash and tangible barter items to survive these unpredictable blackouts. The new global world order will be determined by whichever nation possesses superior technology. The advancing artificial intelligence revolution is the most critical technological arms race in history. China and the United States are currently locked in a desperate battle for dominance. The sovereign nation that achieves artificial general intelligence will dictate global military economic terms. This unprecedented technological disruption will completely eliminate millions of traditional middle-class corporate jobs. You must actively and aggressively upgrade your personal skills to remain relevant in the economy. The toxic combination of massive job losses and raging inflation will severely test social cohesion. This is exactly why Dalio predicts a remarkably high probability of severe civil conflict. Desperate citizens resort to extreme political measures when their basic economic survival is threatened. You must mentally and financially prepare your entire family for prolonged periods of instability. Building a highly resilient local community network is absolutely essential for your ultimate survival. You simply cannot survive this massive global transition isolated entirely from your trusted neighbors. The previous peaceful world order heavily relied on cheap energy and highly cooperative trade. Both of those fundamental economic pillars have now been completely destroyed by intense rivalry. The next dangerous decade will dramatically separate the financially prepared from the oblivious public. The massive ongoing wealth transfer occurring right now will forever alter the class structure. The traditional American middle class will be entirely wiped out by the inflation tax. Only elite investors who hold scarce productive assets will successfully preserve their purchasing power. You must completely and utterly reject the comforting lies pushed by mainstream media broadcasts. They are desperately trying to artificially maintain a fragile illusion of control over systems. Dalio's robust historical framework completely strips away these illusions and reveals the brutal truth. The terrifying mathematical reality of our massive national debt guarantees a catastrophic currency crisis. The shifting geopolitical tectonic plates guarantee a dark future defined by severe military conflict. Openly acknowledging this dark reality is not pessimism, it is simply prudent risk management. You still possess a very brief critical window of opportunity to position your portfolio. This requires incredible emotional discipline to act decisively while the general uneducated public sleeps. Do not let dangerous normalcy bias paralyze your critical decision-making during this transition. The fact that disaster has not struck yet does not mean it is impossible. The historical macroeconomic cycles Dalio outlines operate on timelines much longer than attention spans. But when the critical breaking point finally arrives, the devastating economic collapse happens fast. Your absolute highest financial priority must be actively protecting the capital you already accumulated. True generational wealth preservation requires owning absolute hard assets entirely outside the fragile system. The American economic empire undeniably declines, and the brutal law of the jungle returns. Prepare yourself thoroughly for the extreme market volatility that will define the coming decade. The ultimate survivors of this massive wealth transfer will be those who understood history. I will continually provide the critical financial truth that the mainstream media completely ignores. If you found this expert financial analysis valuable, please smash the like button immediately. Share this urgent economic warning with absolutely everyone you know who needs wealth protection. Subscribe to the channel right now to never miss another critical global market update. Leave a comment below explaining exactly how you are personally preparing for this crisis. Stay incredibly safe, stay highly vigilant, and always protect your family from future storms.